Aloha and welcome to another edition of Hanging at the Reef. I'm your host, Jeffrey Rich, and today we are honored to have two distinguished guests, Dr. Allison Goff and Dr. Linda Learheimer. Dr. Allison Goff is the Dean of the College of Liberal Arts and an Associate Professor of History at Hawaii Pacific University. She holds a PhD in History from The Ohio State University and a BA from the University of Durham in England. Her research focuses on American social movements, particularly the anti-slavery and civil rights movements. Dr. Goff is also deeply engaged in women's studies, teaching courses on women's history and exploring the significant roles women have played in shaping our world. Joining her is Dr. Linda Learheimer, Professor of History and Humanities and Director of the Honors Program at Hawaii Pacific University. She also oversees the minor in Gender and Women's Studies. Dr. Learheimer earned her PhD from Princeton University and specializes in European history and gender studies. Her research delves into women and religion during the Reformation era with a focus on 17th century France. Together we'll explore their journeys, their impactful research, and the broader impact that women's history has had on our world. Stay tuned for an enlightening conversation. Welcome to the show, Allison and Linda. I'm excited to have you on today. It's Women's History Month in March, and in honor of all of the amazing accomplishments throughout history of incredible women, we thought that we would pay some homage to the history of accomplishment and have a conversation about impactful things that women have done throughout history. We'll take a special look at what's happening here in our country in the current context of the political climate. So it should be an interesting conversation, and thanks for joining me today.
Thank you for having us.
Yes, thanks, Jeff.
Let's start with why do we have Women's History Month here in March? Give us a little history on the background, what the intent is of calling attention to the accomplishments of women throughout history, but what was the impetus of establishing a Women's History Month?
So the first Women's History, commemoration, it wasn't even a month at the time, it seems to have started in the 1970s, the late 70s in California, in a community in Santa Rosa. A group of women there got together to, honor the accomplishments of women. And it kind of started and snowballed from there. It was President Carter who in, I think it was 1980, said we're going to observe an entire week, right, to acknowledge the accomplishments of women. That turned into a month in 1987. And then since the 90s, each president has made a formal declaration, right, in March regarding women's accomplishments. And it was linked initially to International Women's Day, which goes all the way back to the second decade of the 20th century. So this is a long kind of history. But I mean, the context is that Women's History Month is a product really of what we call second wave feminism. And we don't have to get into whether waves isn't a useful concept to understand feminism, because there's so much overlap in this, but at least we'll use that kind of construction. So, second wave feminism is a movement from about the 1960s up to about the 1990s, which kind of sought to take women's gains beyond what was essentially, the equal rights in terms of voting, which was part of first wave feminism. Education was part of that as well, into kind of other arenas, particularly kind of equality in the workplace, reproductive rights, an attempt to address violence against women, an attempt to challenge kind of gender roles. And so this whole impetus to kind of put women front and center, right, in a Women's History Month came out of that second wave of feminism. And probably for most of our listeners, if they're the same age as the students, right? This seems like ancient history. It's not ancient history to Linda and I, and probably to you, Jeff.
Not to me either.
With all pardon. It's not ancient history, but to give it a little bit of historical context, the women's movement, was part of that huge social kind of uprising from the 50s, really, through to the late 70s and 80s to try and push for equal rights for groups across, right, the human spectrum. So the women's movement in this era in particular grew out very much. The civil rights movement in the United States, both its successes and also women's complaints with the civil rights movements as well. I mean, there was a great deal of what people might say sexism within some elements of the civil rights movements, and that undoubtedly created this social movement. But there are a lot of other social movements, as you know, American Indian movement, Chicano movement, et cetera, et cetera. It was just a tumultuous kind of period. And there was a great deal of overlap, right, between these movements. So it's coming out of this general context, right, of social activism from the 60s onwards, and then a particular focus on the cause of women. So that's the kind of background for where this celebration, I think, came from.
So the women's suffrage movement was considered the first wave. We move into the second wave, which really hit its peak after the civil rights movement in the 60s, and we move into the 70s, where we had a new sense of empowerment for women entering the workplace in ways that they hadn't previously. Social movements, bra burning, for example, and all the things that happened in the 70s that really made women feel that it was a decade where they were moving ahead to really get on par with men in our society. Linda, what were your impressions of that era? Looking back as a historian and a scholar, it was a traumatic time, a time of turmoil in this country, and a lot of social change occurred in the 70s.
Yeah. So, I'm old enough to say it's not just as a scholar, but as a person, I can look. That was when I was coming of age. And I want to also say that bra burning, it was only one time that happened. And it's become like everybody talks about bra burning, but it happened once at a particular anti-Miss America demonstration. So it's the idea that women were out there burning their bras I guess it's symbolically they were, but not really. So I guess I wanted to add that as a student, when I was in college, there was no women's history, or at least I wasn't aware of it. It was just starting. I'm old enough to say that when I had my history classes, women were absent from the curriculum. But this is about the time when new, programs are being started in the academia and the university. And that comes out of those social movements, including the women's movement. And I just remember I decided to be a historian because I realized I wanted to give voice to the voices of to women in the past who had been left out of our history books. And I think that, in addition to to second wave feminism, and this is a part of second wave feminism, is that move in universities not only to deal with women's history, but also the history of all groups that had been marginalized in history. So the rise of social history creates a place for women's history. And then I was so excited about doing history because I felt like I could fill some of those gaps. And there are only a few articles that I read in my history classes that dealt with women. So that's for me, it's very personal as well as academic. Seeing, by the time I got to graduate school, I was working not just in the history department, but also I was very closely affiliated with them, with a women's studies program at the university I went to. And so that transformed me as a scholar. And so, for me, Women's History Month sort of represents those changes that are happening in the academy as well as in sort of general society.
Yeah. So the establishment of the Women's History Month in the 70s, and its meaning to call out milestones throughout the process of women gaining more equal status in our society. What are some of those milestone occurrences? We know about suffrage and the women's right to vote, but as you look through the 1900s and up now through the 2000s, what are some of the other milestones that have been part of that movement and seen either success or failure in terms of women gaining more adoption of some of those important societal norms and attributes?
I guess for me, the women's movement isn't so much about milestones. Maybe that's dodging the question, but I mean, milestones are important, but um, this is I mean, I guess we're getting into whether the wave metaphor is a good one, because the movement towards gender equality and changes related to women's status and equality. It's not like it. It's not like the milestones are important, but they're it's a long history and it's all connected. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So obviously there's certain events that are important, like gaining women's suffrage and the 19th Amendment, and Roe v. Wade was very important in 1973. A negative milestone is the overturning of Roe v. Wade in 2022. And there are all sorts of other, I guess, accomplishments, though, that get lost in the shuffle if we just focus on those milestones. Does that make sense?
Let's focus on one specifically that, really gained momentum in the 70s. And I think it was, again, driven by the entry of more and more women into, the job market, and not in the historical roles that they had played before in maybe administrative types of positions, secretarial positions. Back during World War II, women taking the place of many men in assembly line type jobs because of the lack of availability of labor. So it seems that the move to fight for equal pay in the workplace really started to gain momentum in the 70s. And that's a movement that we still struggle with today. And I think the most recent statistic is it 85%, 85 cents on the dollar?
I think it's 83.6 or 7.
So I gave more credit than was due. So
yeah, so I just lectured about this in class. Yeah.
So we still haven't achieved complete parity in terms of equal pay for women. How has that issue taken stage and been front and center and evolved over the last really 50 years now since it became an important issue in the women's movement?
Okay, so I keep bringing this personally, but when I was a college student, I had a button that said 59 cents. Kind of shocking. So there's been a huge improvement, but in the last 10 years, it's stalled. And any gains that we've made recently for women have been because men have gotten poorer, not because women have made, there have been changes in terms of women's status. So that's kind of sad. I guess there was a lot of hope. I think a lot of people thought that just changing attitudes would be enough to bring about equal pay. And there's been a lot of pushback to laws. I don't know if most people realize that women's rights are not guaranteed in the Constitution. The Equal Rights Amendment did not pass. So we do have federal legislation that guarantees, that women have equal rights, but it's not enshrined in the Constitution. So that's kind of a problem. But a lot of the things that are needed for equal pay have to do with things that we can't just change because of attitudes, like the lack of maternity leave, paid maternity leave, the lack of paid childcare. We don't have the programs that are needed to support women in the workplace. And I mean, some men have taken on half the duties, but that statistics show that women still do this second shift of work, even women who are in the workplace. And women who take time off from work, they never can catch up. So that's part of the problem, right?
And it seems like, historically we've looked at this old paradigm of belief of the way a nuclear family was meant to exist in the United States, and it's the quintessential image of a 50s family, the stay-at-home mother, the hardworking father, the perfect kids, the wonderful house in the suburbs. Mm-hmm. And the significant change from that image then to today, of course, is the need for women to work and to enter the workforce like they never have before, and to pursue careers like they were never really able to before, but now in some cases maybe are forced to pursue because of the economic scenario that we've created in this country. And it seems to me that one of the fundamentally unjust evolutions of this movement is that while women have gained, more power in the workplace and the ability to pursue jobs and a more leveling of the pay equity, that they're still saddled oftentimes with maintaining that perceived role as being the mom that still has to maintain that household and really have two jobs now. And I imagine that remains a major issue. And it's one that requires some generational change in our society to recast what a family unit is all about and the roles of men and women in a marriage in American suburban life.
Yeah, and even if we change attitudes, the reality is that if women are getting paid less, this happened during COVID, right? The women dropped out of the job market at higher levels than men, and that was an economic decision in most cases because men tend to get paid more than women. So it's just it's kind of a never-ending cycle. We have to change policies. We can't just change attitudes.
Yep.
In order to achieve some equality in the workplace.
Well, Allison, I know, any conversation about women's movements and all would be remiss if it didn't have some, content around women's reproductive rights. And we touched upon it earlier, and it seemed like that was a battle that had been fought and won almost 50 years ago. And Linda, as you've called out, we've seen now a reversal of Roe v. Wade, and now that issue has become front and center again. And it's obviously intertwined with political issues, with religious issues, and it remains one of the primary polarizing issues that separate the political factions in our country. Where do we go from here, given what's happened in the last couple of years and the reversal of a woman's right to choose?
It's such an emotional issue for me and such an important one because I believe women cannot have equality without having the right to control their own bodies. I mean, that's just the bottom line. And I mean, people can have moral objections to abortion, but they also need to acknowledge that if women don't have control over whether or not they have a child, both to have a child and not have a child, then men are always going to have more rights than they do. And the problem is that it's not just abortion rights. There are all these other rights that go along with it. Fetal personhood laws, for example, that are criminalizing pregnant women. So this is one of my worries is not just, women are dying because of these laws, because women who need to get an abortion to save their lives even can't get abortions because their hospitals are so reluctant that they're worried about breaking the laws. But there are also these laws that are being passed that say that, a woman who does anything to jeopardize the unborn child is basically can be convicted of murder or child abuse. And that means that pregnant women no longer have full rights as human beings.
Yeah, there's no question that we're in this malaise of lack of uniformity in laws and regulations, and we're going state by state on different, policies and laws that must be adhered to by doctors and women seeking abortions. It all makes me think that, the 50 years of thinking that this issue was settled, and now having it be, front and center again, and having such strong support from the vast majority of Americans, Democratic and Republican, and all things in between, to re-engage on this topic makes me think that the issue will again take front and center stage and become a driving force in the women's movement and another rallying point to maybe regain some of the power and the influence that the movement has had that seems to have waned a little bit in the last really couple of months in particular.
Yeah, I would say this is the issue that my students in particular are most concerned about. I mean, they feel like the the rules have just been switched on them. And I think for the people who have been living through this, women who have been living through this, who are upset, that's galvanizing them.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes anger and grief are galvanizing forces. And it's kind of ironic because I remember the moment where I really became angry and dedicated myself to being an activist on women's issues was when I read about forced sterilization in the 1970s. It's a reproductive rights issue. The fact that women are being forced either to have or not to have babies is it just gets me really upset and angry. And I think that's not just me. That's true of most of the students I teach and other people I talk to of the younger generation. So I agree. I think it's galvanizing women especially and it's galvanizing a movement.
Yeah, and the movement, really gained a lot of steam just a short number of years ago with the Me Too movement. Allison, I wanted to ask, your impressions of when you look back at what really started and moved forward with the Me Too movement. How much of a role has that played, and do you think it will play in continuing to galvanize? Or has that movement lost its steam and some of the new challenges that are now being, confronting us with the new administration and some of the changes in law and some of the executive orders that are being pushed and pushing reproductive rights back down to the states? Does the Me Too movement remain a force and a rallying point, or has that lost its steam in the last couple of years?
Linda can disagree, but I think the Me Too movement was a relatively short-lived movement. I think it, very importantly raised consciousness about a key issue that women, even in first-wave feminism, we're talking about violence against women. And that issue of violence against women was linked to all sorts of other social movements as well, for better or for ill, like temperance and things like that. And that's been a thread throughout all waves of feminism, quite frankly, violence against women, which is why this wave theory is a little bit, inappropriate, I think, to understand the women's kind of rights movement. So, in an age of social media, the virality, is that a word? Yes, of our society really helped to propel this really important issue to the front of public consciousness. I think a lot of very positive things happened as a result of that, but it's really disappeared. I really think, at the moment, and part of that is, I think people were so shocked with the overturning of Roe versus Wade. I mean, even with the benefit of historical training, I don't think Linda or I thought that was ever going to happen in our lifetimes, having both of us lived through achieving that and then that being taken away. And so I think sometimes, women have to prioritize what can we, what is most important to us? What can we achieve? Now, obviously, violence against women is a very key and ongoing issue, but there's only a certain bandwidth, right, that social movements have, and they often work better if they appear to be single issue movements. The civil rights movement is an example of that. When it began to kind of diversify a little bit more in the late 60s and 70s, it kind of became a target. It became very vulnerable. It could be very easily outflanked as it moved into more economic rights issues. All social movements have those problems. There are problems of being single issue movements, but on the other hand, that does help to deliver a consistent kind of message. So I think at the moment, and Linda is absolutely right, I'm hearing this from my students as well, reproductive rights is the thing at the forefront. And of course, that is linked in many ways to violence against women in so many ways. But yes, I think, this leads to another kind of discussion about issues that I think are at the forefront for women at the moment, and this has to do just generally with violence against against women, the commodification of women's bodies, what is happening to images of women in social media, how that's impacting particularly young women, but also the behavior of young men as well. I mean, these are all interlinked things with which we need to be kind of concerned. Some of those things are very hard to deal with, though, when you try to put them into a kind of campaign, right, kind of format. The important thing, as you know, right, is messaging, right? Mm-hmm. When you try to explain something that's very complicated, right, and campaign on that, the results are often not what you want. But all of these things are very much, I think, interlinked. There have been a lot of very worrying studies recently about the increase rate of violence across social classes of women as well, that undoubtedly have been inspired or at least influenced, right, by images that people are seeing in social media, over which people have no control. So it's interesting, right? There's, on the one hand, censorship of women going on in one area, but we're going to allow, right, certain images of women and attitudes towards women to go unchecked and uncensored in another area. And this is the duality that women have had to face throughout, right, history. And one thing the women's movement has tried to point out, right, the hypocrisy and the contradictions, right, of being female. Yeah,
I agree that I think that everything's interlinked. I think reproductive rights and violence against women, they both have to do with women's bodily autonomy. And my students care about both issues, but it is true that reproductive rights are at the forefront right now in terms of, what people are being active about. But I don't think that violence against women has dropped out. I think that Me Too, there was a huge backlash against Me Too. I mean, that's being seen all over with, especially on social media. The ones who are arguing for traditional masculinity, and but it's still an important issue. It's just their ebbs and flows, right? But my students really care about this, and I do think that Me Too, even though it didn't have I feel like it didn't have that big an impact in the great scheme of things, but it did. I think it changed attitudes towards consent. I really feel like we used to have this argument about consent. I almost feel like that's, at least with my students, there's a much clearer sense of that we need to that consent needs to be obtained, and that it's not acceptable for if you don't have it to continue. So anyway, I feel like the argument about consent is not something that's
I think you're right, but I think one of to go back to the 60s and 70s tropes of the women's movement, it was about consciousness raising. And I think that's what Me Too did as much as. Yeah. I think there's this process of thinking once and twice and three times about things that wasn't there before, which I think is really important. We were talking about, attitude and legislation, and Linda and I might disagree a little bit about this, but I mean, I'm a historian of social movements, largely African-American movements. I mean, we passed the 15th Amendment, right, and the 13th and the 14th Amendment. That was legislation, but it took a long, long time, right, for those to really be implemented, because that did not change hearts and minds, as they say. That's a really difficult thing to do. But I do think the Me Too movement in that way did get people at least to think about this and maybe pause on some things that they wouldn't have done before. So I think that's really important.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that absolutely the Me Too movement raised awareness and consciousness over these issues. And it served a vital purpose in our society. It created an opportunity to address, some of the issues of misogynistic behavior, the imbalance of power in the workplace that has existed. So we've seen some positive outcomes from that movement. Has it lost some of its steam, particularly in light of the change in direction on reproductive rights or some of the other actions coming out of the administration? Probably. But I think it was a very positive and important influence in our current society, and one that's really changed some attitudes and perceptions. I want to come back to the issue of representation of women in leadership and political roles, because that's been something that we've struggled with for a long time. You could argue that we've made strides in both areas. If I look at the corporate world, for example, although there's still a huge disparity in the number of women CEOs running companies, it does seem like women have really made progress in obtaining, stronger representation in key leadership executive type roles, and have gained some ground in holding political power, particularly in more local offices where, people are more in touch with local issues. So, give us your opinion on the momentum that we've created. And, overall, where do things go from here in terms of women continuing to gain importance in the workplace and our political wranglings?
Shall I start with politics, Linda?
Sure. I have some stuff to say about politics.
So as you know, I grew up in England, and we had a political leader, a female political leader, the Prime Minister in 1979. She took office, Margaret Thatcher. And there have been political premiers who are females now across many societies, and there are many that predated England as well. We still haven't had, a female president here. I mean, yes, women are moving more into these offices. But interesting thing, I talk to my students about gender and political power. And obviously, I'm going to use that example of Maggie Thatcher. And I remember very distinctly from when I was growing up, some famous cartoons in the Guardian newspaper. And there was this cartoon of Margaret Thatcher, several cartoons. They always portrayed her wearing a three-piece businessman suit and a tie and smoking a cigar, right? In order to wield political power, she had to have the trappings, right, of manhood. And I don't know if you know, when she was trained to be prime minister, she had a voice coach. So they, trained her to lower her voice because nobody was going to pay attention to her. She was female. In my history classes, I have the students look at one of the, as far as we know, one of the few female pharaohs in Egypt, an individual called Hatshepsut. And so this is thousands of years ago, right? In order for her to have legitimacy as a political leader, she had to be portrayed wearing just the same garb, right, and trappings as the male pharaohs. And so I asked my students to reflect on how far we've come. I still think, right, that women are required to have those masculine traits in order to be accepted, holding political power in this country in particular. And Linda, you can speak to that a little bit more.
Well, I would say they're expected to, but then they're also condemned if they do. So, I mean, it's that double bind that women leaders have, and this is true of corporate leaders too, If you're supposed to behave like a man, because but then if you do, you're penalized for it. So, because you're not feminine enough, because power is defined as masculine. I mean, even male leaders get condemned. Like Obama was made fun of for being too feminine, for wearing mom jeans, right? So power is coded as masculine, and that it's really hard to get beyond that to come up with different models. Mm-hmm. I just wanted to say a little bit about how, first of all, the U.S. is far behind most of the countries in the world in terms of political representation. We have a quarter of the Senate is female, which is a huge leap from just not that long ago. Less than 30% of the seats in the House of Representatives are held by women. It's not that much better at the state level. 12 states do have women governors, so it's about a third. But in countries like Rwanda, Cuba, Nicaragua, Mexico, Andorra, and the United Arab Emirates, more than 50% of the representatives are women. So just to keep that in mind in terms of political representation, and they're not all the most advanced countries when it comes to women's rights. I just wanted to say one thing about just we have a particular kind of government. The way we elect our president is different from in the UK and in a parliamentary system. It's a lot easier to get a woman leader in a parliamentary system because the leaders are chosen by the party. And then also some countries have quotas for women representatives. In France and in many European countries, there are laws that say there's a parity law in France that says you have to put forward each party has to put forward an equal number of male and female representatives or candidates for office. And in the US, that wouldn't fly because, we have all these ideas that quotas are bad. But that's something that also I think, because you have to have a certain number of people in power before you can get the leader, right? And if you don't have parity at the lower levels, you're not going to get, it's much harder to get a female lead.
Yeah. Well, I think you're right on that, and in the current environment, quotas are not a good idea to pursue. So that may not bear fruit. But, you've mentioned other countries around the world that are more progressive on acknowledging women in leadership roles. What's holding us back in this country? We've now had our first, African-American president. We've had a female vice president. But what is it? Is it candidate quality? Is it societal bias? What are the factors that are preventing America from taking this last step and putting a woman in the White House?
Yeah. I mean, as Linda said, right, it's the structure of the political system here. Most of the political leaders who are female in Western democracies come up through, right, the political system. So given that we have a lower, right, number of women in the Senate, in the House of Representatives, where, presidents, et cetera, usually come from, or from governorships, that's an issue as well.
But I want to ask the question a different way, though, because I know we did touch upon some of this. I want to get to the heart of, what are the perceptions that Americans have? When you go down into rural parts of the country or urban parts of the country, you've got very different points of view about things. But if you had to guess, what is it about Americans' perceptions of women in leadership, putting aside the reality that the more power that any group accumulates, women, men, Black people, people from other, factions of the world, the more they gain power, the more solidification occurs and the more that they can grow that. And women have achieved a lot of, leadership roles. And as you mentioned, we've seen these numbers grow in terms of congressional representation. But it seems like there is this mental hurdle. And if we look just at the very last election, we took the step of putting an African-American in the White House. It seemed like the United States was tracking towards not even, really having a debate about the fact that one of the two major candidates was a woman, and it wasn't necessarily a central issue for a lot of people. But what we found with the outcome of the election is that it really was. So there's some hurdle that still exists in this country that we just can't get beyond. And if you had to surmise, what's at the heart of American thinking that's really preventing this, what is it? Is it our history? Is it our current political debate? But what's driving those perceptions and preventing this next step?
I just think, sexism.
Pure and simple. Sexism.
I was reading something. People don't like to think that they're sexist, but then when it comes down to voting, they are. So I read a quote from a communication professor at Colorado State that says, American voters tend to believe in the abstract that they support the idea of a woman candidate, but when they get the real woman in front of them, they find some reason not to like the candidate. And there have been studies that have shown that if you put this is like for president, but also for jobs, if you put two identical resumes in front of people and one's a man's and one's a woman, then people just automatically see the male candidate is more qualified. So that's just, one of the reasons. I think people also think that women somehow are biased because they're women, when, as if men are the norm and women are somehow only care about women's issues. But I do think that people not being able to, people don't like to admit that they're biased or sexist, but they are.
Yeah, I think you're right on. And I think what we say and what we do are often two different things. And we've seen that play out. And it seems like this mental hurdle is still one that we have to take a step beyond. I want to talk a bit also about social media and its impact on the women's movement, on women's perceptions of their self-image. So let's chat a bit about that. How has social media either helped or hurt the women's movement, and in particular, young women who now see stereotypes of what women are supposed to look like, how they're supposed to act. And it's a new dynamic that's really been brought into this equation, and one that maybe we're still sorting through to see what the impact is going to be. Is it going to be positive or negative? But what are your perceptions about how social media is contributing, to this issue?
I think it's both. I think it's both good and bad. I think there are a lot of negative effects of social media on women. There's studies that show that it has a negative effect, not just on women, but also on our girls, but also on boys' self-image. And there's been studies that have shown that girls who look at social media, it correlates to eating disorders, right? But on the other hand, it can be a really useful tool. And the Me Too movement is a good example of how social media can be used for organizing and to get a sense of connection, not just locally, but nationally and internationally. So I think it's a really powerful tool. And a lot of my students, they have to do an action project in my class, and a lot of them organize social media campaigns to try, to raise awareness about issues. And there's a lot of activism and organizing going on online. So I think we have to recognize the good as well as the bad when we talk about social media, and particularly its role in activism. Teaching people to be aware. I teach people to be media aware and media literate. That's really important because it gives you sort of power to push back and to critique those images that you see. It's not enough to just overcome their effect.
Yeah, it seems like it's had, two very definitive impacts, one positive and one negative. Yeah. The negative being, as you called out, on mental health and body image, things that both young men and women sometimes struggle with. But on the positive side, and it's one of the wonderful things about social media, is the ability to create affinity groups that affirm your point of view and make you feel a level of comfort because you find your tribe, so to speak, and other people that feel the same way about that issue. And that is one of the most powerful ways to create a social movement, is to aggregate people with a common belief. And we see that happen all over the place. So, Allison, does that good outweigh all the negative that we hear today about how social media is impacting young people, social isolation, as well as the mental health and body image perceptions that create problems?
I think there are a lot of problems. There are quite a few studies out there that have showed a really strong correlation between heavy social media use and the increased risk of suicidal ideation and attempts in adolescence, with a lot of research suggesting there's a much stronger association for girls and for young women. Really significant opposed to boys. And this idea of affinity groups, yes, they can be empowering, but a lot of this research shows that they are disempowering, right? There are affinity groups around some very negative, kind of kind of typing. Cyberbullying, online harassment. Yes, males and boys are subject to that as well. But studies have shown that it has a more significant impact on young girls and young women, which is the way it was in the pre-social media, era as well. So I'm not sure. I think it's very difficult when you are an adolescent, male or female, but particularly female, right, to construct, right, these powerful self-images of yourself, right? Women's bodies go through a lot, right, in the teenage years. A lot of these changes are being exploited as very negative on social media, and this is just adding, I think, to the pressure for young women. So, a lot of studies have always showed that peer pressure has acted greater on young women than young men. And I think this has just been compounded by social media. And it takes a great deal of strength, right, to find positive affinity groups. I say to my students, I don't know what I would have done if I'd have been, given a cell phone when I was 13 or 14. We have a lot of negativity towards adolescents, but they're facing a whole load of stuff that we did not have to face.
Yeah.
So I'm a little bit more pessimistic than Linda is about this. I want to be optimistic, but I do see the damage that this is doing to particularly young women. So I certainly appreciate what actually some school districts are doing now with banning cell phones in schools. I actually think that's a good use of regulation. But there's a whole lot more that needs to be done. Yes, we need to do our role as educators in talking to young women about social media and its effects and being critical. I've already sat on 2 thesis committees in communication where female students have dealt with precisely these issues. They are concerned about this. So that level, again, of consciousness, we get back to consciousness, is the first kind of step to kind of taking control of this. But this is a huge problem.
Yep. Yeah. Well, our entire conversation has called out issues, good and bad, ones that we've moved forward on and made progress, ones that we've had to retrench on. So, the question of, is feminism still needed today seems obvious. So I'm going to restate it, ask it a different way. How does feminism move forward in this society and continue to build upon the work that we've seen historically and navigate the current political climate? But, if you had to sort of prescribe a roadmap, where do we go and how do we keep the movement moving forward and addressing the issues that are of most relevance for women in gaining, truly co-equal status in our society?
That's a really good question. I think activism is really, really important. And I think that's happening because women's rights are under attack, and we have a new generation. I'm really, really impressed by. I run a club called the Gender Equity Movement, or I'm the advisor, and my students are awesome, and they really are. I mean, they're a model of what needs to happen. Is that people getting involved in doing. There's a lot of community things that they can get involved with and actions that they can take, lobbying for issues. We depend on the next generation, but the next generation can be supported and learn from the previous generation. One of the things that I find kind of annoying about the way third wave feminism is defined is that it's defined as kind of a rebellion of the daughters against the mothers. I mean, that's one of the things that with the waves, people often say, oh, the daughters are rebelling against the mothers. But what we really need is for that knowledge to be passed down from those of us who were involved in social movements in the past, and working for these rights that now are being taken away, but also recognizing that things have changed, that we have something to learn from the new generation. And I feel like I get energized from learning from my students about things that they can do with the tools that they have now that maybe I wasn't, I didn't have when I was younger. So I think working across generations and also working across national boundaries and working together not just for gender equality or gender justice, but also like the whole idea of intersectionality is that you can't just separate off gender equality or solving the issue of gender discrimination from race and disability, from all these other forms of discrimination, because women are all those other things as well. And I mean, men are involved in all of those things as well. So we have to look across. We have to be working together across those different boundaries, I guess. I don't know if that makes sense.
Well, I think the interesting thing is that the big boundary is between men and women. Recent surveys, very interesting, show that there's a bigger gap on feminism and gender roles within Gen Z than there was in previous generations. So,
our listeners understand that. So the gap in perceptions of gender roles is growing among Gen Z, not shrinking.
Yeah. So there, a survey, I think it was out of Imperial College London or some UK university in London, showed that when asked the question, for example, about traditional roles like men should stay at home and look after the kids, that they can do that as much as a woman can, there was a closer agreement on that being okay between Gen Xers than there is on Gen Zers. I mean, more females think that, that's okay to do in Gen Z, but more men in Gen Z think that's not okay to do. So there's this gap. And same with feminism. More Gen Zers, females think that feminism is a positive thing, fighting for equal rights is a positive thing, but fewer men than in previous generations. That's a worrying trend, right? So, totally agree with with Linda on intersectionality, but then also that intersectionality, right, applies to looking across the gender divide as well. That seems to have grown, which is a curious and somewhat troubling kind of finding. Yeah,
and that's reflected in politics too, because you see the huge gender gap in politics with women much more liberal and men much more right leaning, and so I guess, I mean, really. The focus, I guess. I don't want feminism to focus on men, but I mean, we need to acknowledge this and find ways to convince men that feminism and gender equality is good for them as well.
Yeah,
because they don't seem to think that.
Well, I think there's some percentage of men that certainly believe that and support that and vote in that favor, and that's what seems so perplexing to me. Is these issues of women's rights seem so obvious to support, and women are a political force when they want to band together and create a movement. And I think we're over 50% of our population now is female to male. So if you have a percentage, even if it is a minority percentage, maybe arguing at worst, of men that support co-equal movements and equality in our society, and it's such a polarizing issue of relevance for women, one would think that this would be a political tsunami in terms of the American voting public supporting women's rights at the polls. But we haven't seen that. We certainly didn't see that in the last election. That's what's so perplexing about what's going on, is what is creating that disconnect in some women from understanding the importance of aligning in support of these issues. Maybe that's the $1 million question that we all need to figure out is, what's the hurdle?
Well, I think some women believe that it's in their best interest that feminism is not in their best interest. So that's another issue.
Does that die out generationally? Is that a generational belief? You called out Gen Z statistics, millennials. Allison, your statistics on what those factions believe. And I think you're right, Linda, but the question is, does generational change solve this problem? Or is there more education and more, political movements that have to happen to create more understanding and awareness? So we're not there yet. Well, this has, been a fascinating conversation. And I think you're right on, with a lot of your assessments. And I think that the next year and a half to 2 years is going to be pivotal in terms of what happens with the movement and where we go next in this country. We could see a complete backlash against what's happening now. and a true banding together of women across the country, moving in concert to move forward instead of backwards. Or, a part of me thinks we could see a continuation of what we're seeing now. And which way we go, I don't know. I don't know anybody that can truly predict that future. But I do feel like the next year and a half is a pivotal point in this country to determine a longer term direction and how we begin to address some of these issues of equality. There's so many critical issues at play right now that are going to determine, where this country goes over the next 50 years. So it'll be exciting to see. And I'm sure that both of you will have a strong voice in the movement and in articulating the things that women, young women in particular, really need to understand and think deeply about as they determine what their points of view are about these issues. So with that said, I want to thank you both for being amazing guests, and I hope to have you back on and we can talk more about this dynamic and other issues of historical importance. So thank you so much for being our guests on Hanging at the Reef today.
Thank you, Jeff.